picking up from what my young friend Mike, mentioned, yes, they have normally been. There are three parties that fought the election. One is, as you said, the DPP. The other is the KMT, and the third is called a new party called the TPP. Now, the DPP stands for the status quo, which basically represents the fact that Taiwan is an independent country. It will not use the word country. It will not use the word, it will not say it is fighting for independence, because Lai Ching-te makes it very clear Taiwan is already independent. If you're already independent, there's no point saying we want independence. We already got it. The second is the KMT, which I think, as you all know, was a party that was born in China a long time ago, more than a century ago, fought the Chinese Communist Party, was defeated, and had to leave for Taiwan together with the leader Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. And since then, they were the dominant party in China until finally the DPP, took over 2 terms. And then, of course, the KMT came back. So that's the KMT. Now you have an entirely new party called the TPP. And that is led by a very charismatic individual, Dr. Ko. Actually, very interestingly, both Lai Ching-te and Ko are both medical doctors. They'd be very much at home in Manipal, actually, if they were to visit. And I hope someday they do visit. They're both medical doctors. And of course, they have very different styles of approaching politics. But Dr. Ke essentially switched from medical practice to politics, and he became the mayor of Taipei. He has a fairly good record as the mayor of Taipei. And that was the plank on which he basically stood for, set up his own party, the TPP, and the TPP became the third party in this current equation. So now you had a contest between 3 parties. Normally, in the previous election when the DPP came to power, 3 parties basically helped the third party helped the DPP, because the second party was very, in Taiwan you use colors. Blue is KMT, green is DPP, and white is the TPP. Now you had what's called a deep blue party. Actually, if I were to Taiwan in this shirt, people are going to mistake me for a deep blue KMT member, whereas the fact is that, for me, all 3 parties are the same, let's put it that way, as someone who's not a Taiwanese. But you have a deep blue. So there was a deep blue challenger in that election. As a consequence, the DPP candidate won, Chen Shui-bian, and he became the president of Taiwan, and that broke the continuous run of the KMT as the party of governance in Taiwan. The KMT itself went through an evolution from a largely military-centered approach to a civilian-centered approach, from an autocratic approach to a democratic approach. And in fact, democracy was introduced by the son of Chiang Kai-shek. I think all of you know who Chiang Kai-shek was, the head of the KMT. One thing that, some of my green friends initially did not like was that I said that in India we have good reason to respect Chiang Kai-shek because he stood for freedom for India. When there were meetings of himself, Roosevelt and Churchill, he argued very strongly that India should be free, and Churchill was very unhappy about that. So he stood up for freedom for India, but as far as Taiwan was concerned, he didn't stand up for much freedom there. He imposed a very authoritarian rule in Taiwan, ruled by his party, and basically ruled by what they call mainlanders. Now, practically everyone in Taiwan is ethnically from some part of China or the other. It's not that there are very few people who are First Nation in Taiwan, that is, who are in Taiwan and who have not really come from China. Large part of the almost all the Taiwanese have come from China. But when the term mainlander is used, it is used in the context of people who came along with Chiang Kai-shek. They were the ruling class. Chiang Kai-shek and his KMT, who came across the Taiwan Straits, they became the ruling class. And for quite some time, they ran an authoritarian kind of a government. Then you had Chiang Kai-shek's son, and when there was the shock of the fact that the United States switched from Taiwan to the PRC, and in the United Nations, Taiwan, which had the Chinese seat, was thrown out of the United Nations, and the PRC was brought in. I think Chiang Ching-kuo read the tea leaves, and he put Taiwan on the road to democracy. So the autocrat's son, who was himself an autocrat, put the country on the road to democracy. And in the first democratic election, the KMT put up not a mainlander, but what is called a native Taiwanese. Now, the word native Taiwanese, somebody whose ancestors came from China, but who have been settled in Taiwan for at least 2-3 generations, is called a native Taiwanese. So a native Taiwanese was put up, Lee Teng-hui, and by the KMT, and he came to power. And Lee Teng-hui was native Taiwanese with a vengeance. He basically ensured the separate identity of Taiwan. Until that time, there was a kind of a make-believe that both sides of the straits will come together. We are all one big Chinese nation. Two sides of the strait are one, separated accidentally or whatever. Lee Teng-hui didn't have any of that. He said, I'm Taiwanese. I have nothing to do with China. And so it was a KMT president elected on a KMT ticket that basically began the assertion of Taiwan towards sovereignty and the assertion of the Taiwanese as a separate entity, separate from the Chinese of the mainland. So today you have a very real disconnect between the Taiwanese and the Chinese. The Chinese are those who are in the PRC. The Taiwanese are those who are in ROC, in other words, Taiwan. So there's a great disconnect between that. And of course, after that, you had Chen Shui-bian, then you had Ma Ying-jeou. Now, Ma Ying-jeou is a mainlander. He is from Hong Kong. His family comes from Hong Kong. And very recently, he went back to China with his family, the Taiwan-based family, reunited with the family who's in China, and visited the graves of his ancestors. Now, visiting the graves of your ancestors is an ancient Chinese tradition. It's a very, very important tradition. And he went there and he was very moved. And Ma Ying-jeou is definitely, if I may say so, deep blue. He believes the Chinese people are one, the Chinese nation is one. Eventually there will be unification, but unification under the KMT, not the CCP. In fact, when Ma Ying-jeou went to mainland China, possibly, I think for the first time, if I'm not mistaken, he is not the president anymore, but he went there, and he, at the graves of his ancestors, you're supposed to say what you did and to say what you want. It's a very emotional ceremony. It's a very wonderful ceremony. I've had the good fortune of attending some of these ceremonies with close friends of mine on both sides of the strait, people who are Chinese and people who are Taiwanese. It's an extremely moving ceremony. And Ma kind of surprised or shocked the minders around him who were communist Chinese by saying, one day we are going to be united under the KMT again. So the KMT once ran the whole of China, and now of course it is not the case, but one day we, the KMT, will rule the whole of China. Now, from that day onwards, all the important appointments of Ma Ying-jeou were somehow cancelled. Everybody fell sick or had bad weather or had to go somewhere, and otherwise he was having some very important appointments. He had met them, and he was going to have some more important appointments during the rest of his stay in China. But after that particular speech, somehow, by sheer coincidence, all those appointments were cancelled. But of course, he returned happy, because he was not speaking to the communist Chinese. He was speaking to his ancestors. And he said what was in his heart, that he would like to see a unified China under KMT rule. Well, I'd like to tell you that 90% of Taiwanese do not want to see a unified China against Taiwanese rule, the KMT rule, DPP rule, or any kind of rule. They don't want to unify with China, period. There's a distinct Taiwanese identity that has come up. And long back, if you guys are good at Googling, you will find that I had written a piece called calling Taiwan the poison pill. That is, if China were to swallow Taiwan, it would be a poison pill, because democracy is now so strong in China. It is strong in China also, but suppressed in Taiwan, that if you swallow Taiwan, then you're going to see democracy expand among the people of China. And that is going to cause immense harm to the Chinese Communist Party. So I call Taiwan the poison pill. If you swallow Taiwan, watch out, CCP is going to face a lot of trouble. That is way back, and I still stand by that. The Taiwanese have evolved on a culture of democracy, and for someone who's been to Taiwan many times over several decades, it's fascinating to see the changes in Taiwan, because it's so completely democratic. And if you don't believe me, watch Taiwanese talk shows on television. You've seen some Indian talk shows on television, I hope. And you've seen that people are very nice natured to each other. They never shout, they never argue, they always speak politely, very reasoned arguments are given. You know, it's exactly like that in Taiwan, only much more so. I mean, short of actually killing each other in the studio, I've never seen that happen, and I've been to studios also. They argue, they shout, they fight. Sometimes, they physically attack each other, and these are the talk shows, because that is part of the fabric of our democracy, at least in terms of talk shows. Hopefully, it won't happen, and certainly violence is wrong, but a lot of argument, a lot of shouting takes place there. The point is, it's now a full-fledged democracy. They don't want to go back. They don't want that to be diluted. And while it's becoming a full-fledged democracy, from 2012 onwards, from Hu Jintao, who was a relatively more relaxed sort of chap, you've got Xi Jinping, who is very much into the control of the CCP. By the CCP, he means CCP leadership. By CCP leadership, he means the top leadership. By the top leadership, he means himself. So essentially, his idea of perfection is controlled by himself over everything that happens in China, and he's working very hard at trying to do that. Nobody in Taiwan wants to, very few in China also, in my opinion, but they can't talk about that. But very few in Taiwan certainly want to follow that particular path. So that is quite a change. The Taiwan of democracy, especially over the last nearly 8 years, Tsai Ing-wen. Now, Tsai Ing-wen has been a lifelong fighter for democracy. Our university had the honor to host her during her only visit to India. We were the hosts for Dr. Tsai when she came to India. And she, that was way back before she was chairman of her party, and of course long before she was president. But she has been fighting for democracy from a very young age. She's a very liberal individual. She believes in individual freedoms. And under her, Taiwan has been transformed. into not just a democracy, but what can be called a liberal democracy. So if you see Taiwan today, you're seeing a liberal democracy. In fact, much more liberal than several so-called liberal democracies in the Europe or democracy that call themselves liberal democracy. Taiwan is really a fully functional liberal democracy, and the Taiwanese people are enjoying that kind of freedom. A kind of freedom which people are really across the streets, they have but in reverse. So the last 8 years have been transformational. Now, China has been watching this. Xi Jinping has been watching this. And because of the influence of cable television and because of the fact that you had a large number of Chinese visitors coming to Taiwan and finding out that a democracy can work. The Taiwanese per capita income is way ahead of the Chinese per capita income. Taiwan is a much more developed country than the PRC. The Taiwanese people overall are much happier than, if you talk about PRC people, if you bring, if you know them well and you go to their houses and they can trust you, then it's a different matter. But certainly when they walk around the streets, there are not very many happy faces. Taiwan, very different. So that's the amazing change that has come about in Taiwan. And that change is now, more and more Chinese are waking up to that change. And therefore waking up to the realization that what the CCP has been saying for more than 100 years, which is that if you have democracy, you've got chaos. If you got chaos, you've got suffering. If you got suffering, you've got human want and poverty and disease and violence and everything. All that's bad in the world is democracy. It's like some horrible disease. And we, the Communist Party, we are the vaccine against that disease. So keep making sure that we are fully injected into your bloodstream so that we keep this disease from ravaging you. Taiwan has proved that democracies work. Of course, if we go to China, you'll find in Chinese television, Chinese internet, a lot of very well created, snippets from the United States, from India, from Britain, from everywhere, showing some pretty horrible facets of life in these countries. And we all know, in every part of the world, definitely in China, every part of the world, there are some horrible events taking place. There are crazy people who indulge in violence. There is poverty. There are other problems that take place. You'll find that there's an effort to indoctrinate the population of China that, look, this is what a democracy is. So let's say, for example, the United States, that if you walk in a road in the United States, the odds are very high that you're going to be shot at. If you get into a shopping mall, the odds are almost 90% that if you go 5 or 6 times, you'll be attacked physically by somebody. That's not the case. That's not the situation at all, fortunately. Although if you watch television, and I am a great fan of television, I must tell you. I like television, I like the media. I'm a great admirer of the media for reasons which I'm sure Vignesh is not aware of. But anyway, but the reality is that that's not the truth. America is still quite a safe country. If you go to, of course, if you go to some Western countries, you will see India is supposed to be a country where people kill each other for sport. In every road you'll find, people killing each other, shouting at each other, screaming at each other. Now I've heard people screaming in their houses at each other. Some of the neighbors that we had, as we moved from Calcutta to Delhi to Bombay to various places, there was a lot of screaming going on. But it's not, to see that that's not really happening. But if you look at Chinese television, that's what's common in India. So when a Chinese tourist comes to India, he finds somehow there's no screaming, hardly any screaming. He goes to the United States, there's no mass murder, with AK-47s or whatever it's called. It's not AK-47. There are these other kind of guns. They're even worse. There are no mass, whatever, muggings and all this taking place. He's a bit surprised. He goes back skeptical about the propaganda that he's being fed. Long ago, there was a prime minister called Narasimha Rao in India. I don't know how many of you guys have heard about him. Narasimha Rao had a little bit of, an informal group of people that he used to talk about, and Kashmir was very much on his mind. Don't forget that Bill Clinton wanted very much that Kashmir should go to Pakistan. China wanted that. The Europeans wanted that. Everybody, Pakistanis certainly wanted that. There was a very active insurgency there. And, they all wanted that kind of thing to happen. But it did not happen. And much of the reason why it did not happen was the use of the Narasimha Rao to ensure that psychologically steps were created to ensure that there was a feeling of oneness between Kashmir and the rest of India. For one thing, Kashmiri students were welcomed across the country. There was a situation in which, you had Kashmiri students and people saying security, we have a problem. They were welcomed across the country basically by administrative order. Kashmiris were encouraged to set up stalls everywhere. Now you've got these emporia everywhere. That was all during that particular period. Very many steps were taken. You had amnesty for Kashmiri people who were militants. All right, you have done some terrible things to 3 or 4 people. Don't do it anymore. There was no mercy to Pakistani militants, no mercy to Afghan militants, but Kashmiris were amnestied if they gave up the gun and genuinely decided that we'll be peaceful from now on. And overwhelming majority of them remained peaceful. So these steps were taken. So what I want to tell you is that, it's very important to understand that psychology is very, very important even in a dictatorship. And when the psychology of the people starts changing and they don't believe the dictator, then there is a problem. And this is, coming back to Kashmir, this is what happened. One of the important things that Rao did was there were some 7 or 8 crossing routes. And each of these crossing routes, masjids were there or were reconditioned or were added to. So the first, Rao was very clear. The first sound that he wanted a terrorist to hear as he came across the border was the sound of prayer in a masjid. The first sight that he wanted them to see was the sight of worshippers at a masjid. Why? Because they had been indoctrinated by the ISI that in India you cannot pray as a Muslim. You cannot, their mosques are absolutely not allowed. And when you come and see that that is wrong, a doubt gets created in your mind, was all that indoctrination correct? And why this is important is, if you are training somebody to be a terrorist who can have a very short lifespan, a suicide bomber, he or she has got to be 100% convinced in his or her own mind about the truth of the so-called postulates on which he or she has embarked into a campaign, into a career of terror. If there is 1% of doubt in that, a suicide bomber will then become only a terrorist trying to avoid being killed. And if there's a 10% doubt, the person will abandon terrorism. So the minute doubt gets created about the narrative that is created about an authoritarian state, that authoritarian state comes into danger. There cannot be any in the public mind about because beyond a point, fear cannot take you in ruling a large number of people. It has got to be fear, authority, okay. It's got to be fear laced with respect. So it's a combination of, it's like when I and my wife had COVID, we were given the Trump vaccine. The Trump vaccine was basically 2 sets of antibodies were, infused into our bloodstreams. And those two sets combined, and I don't know what happened, but both of us, I mean, my wife had fever, I was feeling awful, I had mild fever, she had a little higher fever, 2-3 days we were feeling awful. As soon as we got the Trump vaccine, by the next morning, we were ready to, to have a jog or something. So these two, respect and fear, have to go together to ensure obedience to the authoritarian state. And when respect goes away, it will go away when you see that democracies work. Then the answer of the Communist Party was, democracy doesn't work for Chinese. The Chinese are a particular type of people. We respect authority. And if we respect the firm hand of authority. If we're not given that firm hand of authority, we become like, whatever, some other kind of people. We become chaotic. We can't perform. All our great progress is because we are authoritarian and because we are Chinese. But you can't be successful as a Chinese unless you have an authoritarian government. Now you have, Singapore is, okay, semi-authoritarian, it's an island country, there are Tamils there are, Malays there. But Taiwan is 95%, if not 97% Chinese, ethnic Chinese. It's a very democratic country. It's doing very well. So how does that argument stand up in the face of the Taiwan example? It doesn't. Let's be honest. And that is where I think, as I said, some of us have been studying developments in China for quite some time. We have been, of course, these days I skip China. I even skip Hong Kong. There have been friends of mine who have told me that it's a good idea to have itineraries where, you've seen enough of Hong Kong, you've seen enough of China. There are also other nice places. Your flight can go via those places, instead of going via Hong Kong or via Shanghai or whatever. So I skipped that. But the fact of the matter is that my view is that General Secretary Xi Jinping, to give him his real title, his power comes from the fact that he's General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. This presidency is nothing in China. You can be, without being General Secretary, the president can be like the Soviet president was. You had the General Secretary of the CPSU, and you had the President of the Soviet Union. And the President of the Soviet Union had no power. The CPSU General Secretary had all the power. But in this case, you have the President and the General Secretary as one person. And the Chairman of the Military Commission. So you have the Chief of Army Staff, you have the entire head of the political establishment, head of the executive, all rolled into one in the person of the General Secretary. I have been, through whatever little information and contacts that are there, that he's not in great shape because the public are beginning to wake up to the fact that there are other systems that can make them even more prosperous. And over the last few years, China has been reducing in prosperity. For several generations, beginning with Deng Xiaoping, up to around the first 3 or 4 years of the Xi Jinping era, when frankly, the changes introduced by him could not take full effect. Every generation has been significantly more prosperous than the last. Your parent generation was much more prosperous than the grandparent generation. The grandparent generation was way more prosperous than their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation. That situation had come about in China. But today, for the first time, you're seeing a generation grow up in China that is less prosperous than the previous generation. So this entire argument that you need the Communist Party for prosperity, and then you compare that with Taiwan, where frankly the economy is quite stable. Despite a lot of efforts to bring it down to size, cut it down to size, and to harm it from the other side of the straits, the economy in Taiwan is stable and growing, and the people of Taiwan are prosperous. Look at property prices. I'd invite some of you to go Google property prices in Taiwan and property prices in big cities in China, and you'll see the difference. Property prices have been going down in China and going up in Taiwan. So democracy works. It's very clear. And now you have a situation by which after the G20 presidency, in which India, as you know, was the president, we're actually growing faster than China. The Chinese economy is growing at a much slower speed than the Indian economy. I'm sure we can grow at a much faster pace, and I would be happy when we go to double digits, which I think will happen in the next 2 or 3 years. But we are growing faster than China. So where is the argument? First of all, that only Chinese can really, essentially the CCP project is a Han project. It's a project that the Chinese people are special people. Now, nobody is a special person. Every human being is the same. There's no special person. And the CCP is essential for Chinese. All those arguments are falling by the wayside by the example of Taiwan and the example of, for example, India. We are doing well. We are not Chinese at all, but we are doing very well. The Taiwanese are Chinese ethnically. They are certainly not a dictatorship, but they're doing very well. So India and Taiwan, IT, coming back to IT, it shows that the CCP propaganda is wrong. And that is where, for example, some of the wholesale changes that have taken place in China, some of the, the shifts in the foreign minister, if you remember, Qin Gang and other people. Now, it doesn't reflect that Xi Jinping is tightening his grip. It reflects that he's being forced to loosen his grip and replacing his loyalists with party loyalists. The CCP loyalist is different from a personal loyalist. Let's say you have somebody who's loyal to a person and loyal to an institution. There's a big difference between institutional loyalty and personal loyalty. Personal loyalists of the CCP General Secretary are being replaced by him with institutional loyalists, which is an interesting symptom. So, all I can say is that the question is, of course, what will happen next. There is a school of thought that says that this is going to lead him to adventure, to an act of war. And, it's a time and tested way that if you have a war, people come together. In any war, in any conflict, people come together. They forget differences. They come together. So, and initially I was under the impression many years ago that the Himalayan frontier could be a theater for a major kind of a incursion. Incursions have been there, nibbling and all that had been there. But after Galwan, I am not inclined to that view as I was some years ago. For the simple reason that at Galwan, the Indian soldier showed what the Indian soldier is. And the Chinese soldier is the single child of parents who are also single children and who have been spoiled sick in their childhood and who are now put on a uniform and are handling a gun, who have never fought in a war all their lives. I mean, I have had the very good fortune, and let me say on record, publicly, the Chinese Communist Party are excellent hosts. When you go there and you're hosted by them, they look after you extremely well. And I have absolutely no complaints in all my visits to China. The CCP has been an excellent host. So I'd like to make that very clear. But I have seen Chinese soldiers. They are wonderful people. I've seen people in campuses in Europe who are of the same kind. And which is why I keep saying that if God forbid, we're in a major war, the United States should basically give us, cover in the sense of arms, equipment, intelligence, etc. Don't send your soldiers here. Please don't send your soldiers here. But believe me, I can tell you, the United States soldier is a real toughie compared to the single child who is now the proud PLA warrior. So at Galwan, they discovered what the Indian soldier is. The Indian soldier is usually doesn't come from a single child family. Usually doesn't come. The Indian soldier has seen some hardship. He has seen fighting. He has gone into battle. He has seen bloodshed. Unlike the Chinese soldier, where battle has only been fought on a video screen or in a simulation. And any simulation that is there, believe me, you cannot compensate for the actual risk that a bullet can hit you and can actually kill you. Now, anybody who has gone into a battlefield situation, anybody who has gone into a terror situation, like entering into a terrorist infested area or even a terror training camp, there's a constant overhang of fear which you can never get in a simulated exercise. So from that point in time, I think they got a fair measure of the Indian soldier. Therefore, I think Taiwan is now at a much greater risk than India is in terms of that kind of an attack. An attack for domestic political reasons. There's absolutely no rational reason to attack Taiwan except domestic political reasons to protect the dictatorship of the General Secretary of the CCP. A war, a hopefully successful war, which in my view is not going to be successful. But this is why that country is important. This is why this particular election is important. This election is important because this country is in the direct line of fire of the CCP, the direct line of fire of the PLA. And it's a very important component in the chain of defenses along the Indo-Pacific. You've all heard about the first, second, and third island chains. You've all heard about Taiwanese mastery of tech. You've all heard about the decoupling that's taking place. And that is inevitable. You may like China very much, but you will have to decouple from China. For simple, I think it was Tim Cook of Apple who was saying that, we like the Chinese because they're smart people, not just because it's cheap. Well, Tim Cook may love the Chinese, and he may have good reasons to love the Chinese, but the fact of the matter is he will not be able to sell his manufactures if he is produced in China, because high-tech items the next 3 or 4 years, any produced in China will be simply unsafe to buy for any country outside the CCP orbit. He could sell them to Iran, he could sell them to Pakistan, he could sell them to Russia, but Tim Cook cannot sell them in the United States, he cannot sell them in India, he cannot sell them in Europe. So I think Tim Cook, poor chap, however much he loves the Chinese, will now have to look at a country named India, for example, for basically shifting a lot of his manufacturers. That is the logic of high tech. And that is the logic of the way the CCP has been systematically copying and reverse engineering the high tech in a very successful way. I'm not denying it. Huawei is a very, very good product. The CCP substitutes are sometimes better than the originals. But the fact is, these are all instruments of war. Today, war is hybrid. It's no longer just soldiers fighting in the battlefield. It's war in terms of affecting agriculture through wrong seeds, seeds that are not resistant to certain, through transmission of diseases, through damage to the economy, through damage to psychologies, by infiltrating the internet space and by creating internet dialogues which promote hatred among sections of the population. The hatred, when you study this kind of thing, and I've got some, there are people who are studying this in depth, people who are very good at getting into these issues, and they say it's not simply a question of saying that China is an opportunity, it's not a risk. CCP is actually a good partner, it's not a threat. It's also hating your own country, your own society, your own people. So not only must you regard China as a great country, you must regard your own country with contempt. If you are an American, America is rotten. An Indian, India is rotten. You're a Britisher, Britain is rotten. Well, as somebody who's coming from a former British colony, I'm not going to argue too strongly about that. Dr. Vijayalakshmi, with your permission, I'll keep, I'm not going to comment on that. But the fact of the matter is that this is the war that's going on. And it's going on as we speak. It's going on, it's going on in the internet space. It's going on in agriculture. It's going on in industry. It's going on in transportation links. It's going on in our telecom. So please keep in mind, in that situation, the fact is the CCP has to win this war. This is what was called, what Dr. Vijayalakshmi pointed out. I gave the first copy that I got of that book before it was actually released. Today it's released all over the world. Anywhere in the world you can buy it. At that time, the only guy who had a copy, 2 copies was me. And 1 copy I gave to somebody I hugely respect, Dr. Vijayalakshmi. And she showed it off to the class. Cold War 2.0, that particular book of mine. I'm trying to work on a 3rd book. Let's hope I make some success in that. A 3rd book in the sense, in that trilogy, 75 years, Cold War and more. But anyway, coming back to that, this is why I can tell you, in this Cold War 2.2 context, Taiwan is absolutely critical to the safety of democracies. For its technology, for its positioning, for its locationing, for all these ways, and for the fact that it is a shining example that democracy succeeds. And whether you're ethnic Chinese or ethnic Indian or ethnic African or ethnic European, it makes no difference. It works for you. The ethnicity doesn't count. It works for you. And that is the significance of Taiwan. And that is the significance of the Taiwanese election. So there was a very heavy campaign to scare the Taiwanese voter. Now, you have a bunch of, American generals and admirals and air marshals, most of them retired and others who, if you recall, Dr. Amrita, I'm sure you've checked my posts on the Ukraine war from the very beginning. I've been a great skeptic of NATO from the very first hours of this particular war, that this is not going to work, it's going to be a total disaster. And regrettably, for once in my life, I've been proved right. So, but the fact of the matter is, when we're talking in those terms, the reality of the situation is Taiwan is far more consequential than Ukraine. What I didn't like about this Biden package was he's offering 5 times more to Ukraine than to Taiwan. When Taiwan is at least 5 times more important to United States security than Ukraine actually is not that important. Ukraine is important to the security of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. But Taiwan is crucially important security to the United States, India, and Japan, Korea, the entire Indo-Pacific. If you have Taiwan going to the Chinese sphere of influence, Japan becomes compromised, Philippines becomes compromised, South Korea becomes compromised, Vietnam gets compromised, India gets compromised, ASEAN, right down the arc. That is where the Taiwanese election comes. And there was a very real campaign of fear. Vote for DPP and vote for war. This was explicitly said by the CCP. It was repeated hundreds of thousands of times by individuals, hundreds of thousands of times on the internet. It's a choice between peace and war. And then you had these American guys coming and saying, don't worry, look at Ukraine. Now, in the beginning they said that, and the Taiwanese, of course, jumped on the bandwagon. I don't blame them because they're standing with the Western countries. They have to do what the Western countries also do. Look at Ukraine. You guys can be the next Ukraine. Now, 2 years after that war started, it doesn't look very attractive to be the next Ukraine, does it? It doesn't look very attractive at all. Ukraine is a mess. You know, some of us had argued, in fact, that Zelensky should accept the status quo, let those Russian-speaking parts go, and be happy like the Georgians are. The Georgians are clever people. They said, all right, we're not going to fight the Russians. They're getting by. Ukrainians, you had Biden, you had Boris Johnson jumping on them. Don't worry, we'll beat the Russian army back not to Moscow but to Vladivostok. And now, unfortunately, Vladivostok is very far away. Moscow is very far away. The Russian border is very, very far away. You understand? And where is Comrade Biden? He's nowhere to be seen. Of course, Comrade Johnson has disappeared. He thought a war would save his prime ministership, but the comrade has disappeared. Why I say comrade is that these are the, thanks to the way the NATO has prosecuted the Ukraine war, it has been a great benefit to China. The one country that has benefited from that war, and the Chinese have benefited immensely from the large number of Americans and Westerners who have come to Taiwan over the last 2 years and said, don't worry, look at Ukraine. You guys will be the next Ukraine. If the Chinese attack, we'll make sure you're the next Ukraine. For God's sake, that cost the DPP an outright victory. The DPP is outright, it didn't get an outright victory, not because of CCP. It was because of these Europeans and Americans coming and telling them, you will be the next Ukraine, don't worry. We'll make sure you're the next Ukraine. People lost confidence. But who wants to be the next Ukraine? Hands up anybody here who wants to be the next Ukraine. Thank God. I don't see any hand up. I can assure you in Taipei, no hand has ever come up. Nobody wants to be the next Ukraine. That is, despite that, despite the very real threat of war, despite the very real possibility of war, the DPP came as the single largest party with more than 40% of the vote. That is 4 out of 10 Taiwanese said, we don't care. If there's war, we will stand by the DPP. I think that's actually the actual proportion will be 90%, but the balance 40%, frankly, 50%. The balance 50% was too terrified. So what did they do? They went for this third option. The third option, I know I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Ko. In fact, I have immense respect for him. He's an absolutely brilliant man. A little, he's got some of the characteristics of a lot of brilliance. His conversations can be pretty lively, if I may say so. But I have immense respect for him. He said, look, I'm a smart guy. I'm one of the best doctors in the world on that particular field. I don't know what it is, a very complicated field of neurosurgery. He is among the top guys in the field. I am smart enough to keep you guys out of war, and at the same time keep you guys from losing any of the freedoms you have now. I am the smart guy. Look at the other two guys. They are good guys. Are they smart compared to me? I am the smart guy. And I think a large number of Taiwanese, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 26% went for Dr. Ko on that argument. So Dr. Ko said, I'm not going to make you sacrifice any of your freedoms, but I'm smart enough to make sure the communist Chinese don't gobble you up or launch a war. So you don't have to be the next Ukraine. The KMT said, we are such charming chaps. We know the Chinese so well. The Chinese also charming chaps. Xi Jinping is such a wonderful guy. He always keeps his word. Don't worry. We will make sure that he keeps his word. I think, frankly, the KMT would have probably done much better. It could possibly have even had a chance of winning the election, given the fear of China. but for the fact that the KMT went overboard in pleasing the pro-China faction. I think this was the hidden hand of, I don't know what hidden hand, but I'm not going to make any comment because I've got many friends in Taiwan and I believe in diplomacy and I'd like to continue with that diplomacy. But there was a hidden hand that made sure that the Taiwanese candidate, KMT candidate, who was a native Taiwanese, not a mainlander, who was basically 100% Taiwanese and very proud of it, the mayor of New Taipei City. His vice president was a very hardcore mainlander. The number one candidate for the Legislative Assembly, and Taiwan, it's a situation in which proportional. So once you have a certain number of proportion of the votes, you have that number of people who are assured of seats. The number one candidate was a person who is completely mainlander, former Mayor Han. So a vice president mainlander, mayor mainlander who would come as speaker. So on both sides, how the native Taiwanese was hemmed in on the right and on the left by deep, deep blue mainlander. I think that is what cost the KMT the election. They wanted to please the mainland. They wanted to please Uncle Sheep. They wanted to please their own hard blue faction. I must tell you that Ma Ying-jeou is a good friend of mine. I am very friendly with all factions in almost in every party. Ko has no faction. The only faction is the Ko faction. That's about it. And I have, to some extent, I think I have very good, I would say I have a deep regard and respect for Dr. Ko. So yes, I call him a friend of mine. But the reality of the situation is that embrace of the fringe of the deep blue in a country where more and more people have ceased to look at unification as not just as a desirable alternative was suicidal for the KMT, and they went ahead and committed suicide. Of course, they got marginally more seats in the legislature, but the guy who really got the most out of this election was the third party. He has got 8 seats now, which is the swing party in the legislature. So if he has an alliance with either KMT or DPP, and in my view, KMT would like to have an alliance with him, but Ko, I think, will be very careful about that. The DPP, probably they're not willing to share ministerial power and diplomatic posts with him. Frankly, I think if they do and they come together, it will be better for them than having deadlock in parliament. But the reality of the situation is the third party came mainly because the KMT got votes not because of love for China, but because of extreme fear of China. Ko got votes not because of a love for China, but because of a confidence in Ko that he can keep China from diluting the freedoms of Taiwan. And the DPP came to power because 40% of Taiwanese people said, the heck with it, if the Chinese come, we'll fight them. We don't care what happens. Okay, we'll be smashed, we'll be in trouble, we'll be whatever. We are going to fight them. And the DPP made a masterstroke. The KMT, in my view, made a huge mistake in the choice of running mate and in the choice of their legislators, some of them. The DPP made a masterstroke in getting a person called B. Kim Shao as the vice president. If you go on Google, you'll find that B. Kim Shao is half English. Now, I think that should prejudice staunch patriots like you and me against her, but don't be prejudiced. She's a very wonderful person. But she knows the West like the palm of her hand. She was the Taiwanese representative in the United States. You know, she knows the West, as I said, extremely well. The West knows her. When she was appointed vice president, when she agreed to be appointed vice president, and William Lai then, agreed to have her as the vice president, William Lai. It was a decision by two people, Beacom Shao and William Lai, and I congratulate both of them for a brilliant decision, because that is what made sure the DPP is now the party of government. It is because of the addition of Beacom Shao to the ticket that William Lai, who is, let's give credit where credit is due, he's been a dauntless fighter for Taiwanese independence, a dauntless fighter for Taiwanese freedoms. He has done it in much more openly than many other people in his own party. But he's been a dauntless fighter. Of course, he's modified his view publicly in the election for the sake of, not scaring people, because nobody wants a war. Nobody wants a war with a big power, especially after seeing what's happening in Ukraine. But this man has fought for decades and decades and decades to protect the independence of Taiwan. There's something to respect. Beacom has, in her own way, fought for decades and decades to protect the independence of Taiwan and to ensure that Taiwan has a chain of alliances, a chain of allies that can protect her in times of war. So this dream ticket won the election, and the other possible challenger, Howe, who was actually a formidable challenger by himself, because of a mismatch made in pandering to the deep, deep blue segment, running after the fringe and getting the majority. Now, to some extent, this could happen to Donald Trump if he is elected. He may pander to the fringe. And I'm not sure if President Biden becomes the candidate that he may win, but if some other candidate is chosen, Trump may lose, because the fringe is never enough to carry an election, and in any case, the deep blue fringe would have voted for the KMT to avoid DPP. You are basically, chasing in the lawn out for a bird that is already there in the nest. The bird is there in the nest, and you're running the lawn and searching all over for that bird and locating it. It's already there. KMT already had the deep blue vote. There was no need to pander to the deep blue, except that I think a hint, a signal came from Uncle Shi that you must show that you love us. Ko is we don't know. He's a neurosurgeon, but we can't read his mind. The DPP doesn't love us, very clearly not. You say that you love us. Show it by appointing people who we know love us. Howe was not a person who the communist Chinese were sure loved them. He was a native Taiwanese. He's not a mainlander. So that appointment was made, and that cost the election to the KMT, and a humiliation, if I may say so, for the CCP. This is a humiliation for CCP, with the immense propaganda of war, social media, nasty, news and fake news items about the DPP in particular, efforts to create rifts within the DPP, efforts finally to weaken Kerr. None of that worked. And eventually the Taiwanese people got back a government that is fully committed to Taiwan, the status quo, which is all that the world wants. The status quo in which Taiwan remains a free, independent, democratic society and country. So if you talk about Taiwan election, this is what happened. Elections are won also by your opponent making mistakes. This election was won by a smart move on the part of William Lai in getting Beacom Shao, and by the very unwise move of, Uncle Shi, in my opinion, advising his nephew, whoever his nephews are in Taiwan, I'm sure he's got plenty of nephews in Taiwan, that look, let's make sure that this gentleman who's a native Taiwanese, on one side he's got somebody who's hardcore mainlander, on the other side, in the legislature also, he's got a hardcore mainlander. You've got a hardcore mainlander as the vice president candidate, hardcore mainlander as the number one legislator candidate of the KMT. I think that cost them the election, and these two decisions, the first decision won the election for DPP, And the second decisions lost the election for the KMT. So it's a democracy. Any election can go any way. Let's be honest about it. This election, it has so turned out that the people of Taiwan, at least 40% have shown that they have the spine to ensure that if necessary, they are willing to fight, to defend their freedom. Fight in the way the Ukrainians fought. And that is significant. Every one of these votes are votes that have been cast in the belief that if DPP comes, there will be war. It's been said by rival politicians. It's been said by the CCP many times. This is a choice between war and peace. You guys decide. They chose, all right, we'll be free, we don't mind fighting, we'll go to war. I think that's something to give them credit for. And as far as the remainder are concerned, whether it's inside the KMT, voting for KMT, I think much less than 10% of the Taiwanese population would ever want reunification. Only 40% are willing to go to fight for that. But not even 10% would want unification. And that is the mistake the KMT made in pandering to that 1% of that 10% that is hard, dark blue. So you pander to that extreme fringe, you lost a lot of votes which would have otherwise come to the KMT candidate out of the very fear generated by the CCP. So the CCP fear could not stop the DPP from coming to power, and the CCP fear was not enough to prevent the DPP coming to power, or to basically ensure the KMT came to power. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic in a democracy. Now, I don't want to go on any further. But I think I'll stop here, and any questions, etc. You guys are most welcome. It's a fascinating kind of a situation, cliffhanging kind of situation, frankly. And on 13th of January, we got the result. As I said, they're all friends of mine. I have immense respect for the KMT. Because basically, KMT in Taiwan was founded by Chiang Kai-shek, who was a staunch supporter of Indian independence. I have, very good friends in the DPP. I have got Mayor Kerr as somebody whom I have warm regard and respect for. So from my point of view, I'm neutral. I don't have anybody. But speaking as an Indian, I'd like to say, I'm very happy democracy won. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm very happy democracy won. And I think this gives me confidence that just as in Galwan, we showed as Indians what we are capable of against an authoritarian force. In the Taiwan election, the Taiwanese have shown an authoritarian force the inner resilience and strength of a democracy. Thank you.